John is going to come back up and he is going to answer the question, really, do we have hope for the future? I think I know the answer because I know this guy's pretty inspiring, but I'll let him take it away. Thanks.
Thanks, Megan, and thanks all of you for spending so much time with us talking about this really important issue of religious liberty. There are things that I believe because I'm a Christian and because I think this Christianity thing is true that I don't particularly like. Do you know about that? Do you know that there are things that are do you have anything that's part of the Christian worldview that you don't really like? Here's the one that I don't particularly like. It's something that you find in the teaching of Paul when he's at Athens. You can read about this. Luke writes about it in Acts chapter 17. When Paul has a chance to talk to the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers and communicate this brand new set of ideas that they don't have any kind of idea what he's talking about, but they love new religions and they love new philosophies, so they invite Paul back, and he takes them all the way back to creation. He wants to tell them about Christ, but he starts by talking about who God is and the nature of reality itself. And he says a lot of really interesting things there, and it's a really interesting, story about how Paul engages these pagan philosophers. But one of the things that he says in the middle of that is somewhere around verse 24-ish, is that the God who created everything determines the exact times that people live and the boundaries of their dwelling place. Do you realize that? That you're in this time and in this place, not accidentally. The fact that you're a Christian and you're in this cultural moment is not an accident. It was intended by God. Not only has God given you particular gifts and abilities and talents and parts of your story, and intentionally not given you other gifts and abilities and parts of your story, but He's put you in this cultural moment and not in another one. And I don't particularly like that. The reason I don't particularly like that is because I have 4 kids. I have 4 kids being raised in this cultural moment. And I don't like what they have to face. I don't like what I have to help them navigate. I'd rather them be born in the good old days. I don't know when they were, but I've read about them. They sound fantastic. And yet God wanted my children to be in this moment, to be in this time and in this place. Well, I hope you have gotten the picture tonight that to be in this time, in this place, is to be dealing with a conflict and a bunch of conflicts from a bunch of different directions having to do with this idea of religious liberty. But I also hope you understand that that conflict is itself the result of deeper questions that our culture is asking. Michael Francisco talked a lot about the religious liberty cases that are at the court. And a lot of them more recently have had to do with COVID-level restrictions. But I think what we can clearly say, that the religious liberty conversations and the cases that are being adjudicated and the place that the church has in the larger society, that's a pre-existing condition. You know what I mean? When we talk about COVID, there are comorbidities that made the disease worse. Well, culturally speaking, COVID didn't create anything. COVID exposed an awful lot. And when it comes to religious liberty, there are 2 fundamental things that Christians have to be ready to confront. Number 1, they have to be ready to confront personally, catechize their kids, and help communicate more publicly that when we talk about faith, we're talking about something that is essential. I got to be honest, I wasn't nearly as concerned, at least in the early days, of governors calling churches non-essential than I was about so many Christians who believed that church was non-essential. And so the idea of staying in your pajamas and not going anywhere and forsaking the assembling of yourselves together, as the scripture would put it, wasn't really that big of a change. It wasn't that big of a disruption. And what we're going to see now as the doors are opening back up is just how many Christians do think that their faith and their faith together with other believers is truly essential. We won't have a prayer to defend religious liberty if we don't see our own faith as not merely a matter of private preference, but a personal conviction of what is publicly true about life in the world. The second thing that has led to this conflict of religious liberty is not just how convicted religious people are about their actual religion, how essential they see these beliefs and these habits and practices and gatherings to be, But also, there's this fundamental question about what it means to be human. Now, listen, I could give a whole talk on this, a whole lot of talks on the image of God and the loss of the idea of the image of God in the public imagination. I don't think that there's a more timely piece of Christian theology, not a belief that's more fundamental to our Christian worldview and more crucial to our cultural witness than getting the question, what does it mean to be human, right? We've got to get that right. So here we are. If God has placed us in this time and place, and that this time and place is defined by a question of religious conviction and a question of what it means to be human, then it's time for us to step in. N.T. Wright likes to say, we don't always get to choose the questions that we have to ask or the questions that we have to answer. But God, if He's put us in this time and place, has called us to this time and to this place. And I was trying to say a little bit of that earlier, that to be placed in this cultural moment is to be placed in a cultural moment where anybody placed in any cultural moment who follows Christ is to be a steward of what is good and what is true. And the only reason we have or we would need to defend religious liberty and to join in this cultural conversation and this public fight is because we're in this moment. We're not in another moment. For many of us, and again, I don't want to speak, as Dr. Myers pointed out so many different times, I don't want to speak for what's happening in other nations, but I tell you what, most of the nations represented by most of you have this heritage of religious liberty, and the world would be a worse place without it. It is worth stewarding because it is a good. And Christians should always be on the side of the good. So I want to just say a couple things here quickly as we wrap up. The first thing I want to wrestle with is if we're called to this cultural moment, and that means we're called at some level to have this conversation, to be a part of this issue when it comes to religious liberty. Let me tell you one way that we cannot properly engage this issue. And this is really important because it's culturally very strategic. There's an option that's being proposed. It's been proposed even in many Christian publications in response to one of the great challenges of religious liberty that's coming through an attempt at federal legislation. It's called the Equality Act. Many of you have heard about it. Now, this is an example just in and of itself that the challenges to religious liberty are many. The fact that Jack Phillips has given 10 years of his life to not compromising his own convictions is not a matter of federal legislation. It's a matter of an unelected local civil rights commission. And we've got state laws, and we've got local courts. And now we increasingly have big tech and big government. So the challenges to religious liberty are many. The Equality Act would be a nuclear option of taking out religious liberty. What the Equality Act effectively would do, especially in this current version of it, is that it would take SOGI, sexual orientation and gender identity categories, and read them or backpedal them, place them into the civil rights legislation. And the civil rights legislation is multifaceted, and it was designed to correct some social level wrongs against African Americans in particular, but against racial minorities. And this would be a nuclear option across the board because it would treat racial minority status as the same thing as decisions about sexuality, decisions about sexual expression. The need for the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s had to do with the fact that African Americans could not actually properly exist and join public life. If you were an African American family and wanted to drive across the country before Civil Rights Act, you couldn't have access. It's very possible you couldn't find a hotel room or you couldn't find gas for your car. Obviously, that same level of disenfranchisement is not the case when it comes to those who identify in any of the LGBTQIA categories. So to read this back through the civil rights legislation like the Equality Act would do would be a nuclear option. Now, what some Christians have suggested is something that is somewhat of a compromise to that legislation. And I don't want to just pick on the Fairness for All Act, which is what this is called. I want to actually talk about the approach itself, which is to compromise with the Equality Act. What Fairness for All essentially would do would say, look, you pass the Equality Act, but just carve out protections for Christian institutions. Now that sounds good up front, but there's a desperate problem with that, a number of problems with that. The first thing is that Christians can't join this issue by allowing something that is not true to be stated as true. A compromise legislation would say, well, look, we know that sexual orientation and gender identity are the same categories as race. Just let us be bigots in our own homes and in our own institutions. The problem with that is it's never good for society when your government says something that is not true. The second challenge is that it would actually deny the legitimate vocation of Christian ministry that every follower of Christ receives. You see, what we believe, one of the big messages of the Reformers, in fact, was that ministers and evangelists and missionaries aren't all the only ones that are called to full-time Christian service, is that to be in Christ is to be called into full-time Christian service no matter what walk of life you're in, if you're a teacher, an educator, a lawyer, a scientist, or anything else. But what a compromise legislation would do it would protect the religious freedom of pastors and protect the religious freedom maybe of Christian educators, but it wouldn't do anything to protect the religious freedom of Barronelle Stutzman, the florist, or Jack Phillips, the baker. And he believes, and he's right in believing, that what he does on a daily basis is an act of worship before God as he uses his creative and artistic talents to bless people in their moments of celebration, just like anybody else does. Look, if a pastor shouldn't have to perform a gay wedding, then a baker shouldn't have to serve a gay wedding. The compromise with these categories is just wrong. Now, I say all that to say, because one of the arguments that often comes back is, well, man, if we get a compromise, you'll be happy. Well, I don't think we will. The practical problems with a compromise solution is a couple of things. First of all, that who are we compromising with? So far, none of the compromise solutions actually have compromised with anybody that actually can make the rules. And also, we have to remember, and we learn this very clearly, at least in the United States context, with the Health and Human Services birth control mandate. Jeff talked about this earlier with the Little Sisters of the Poor, that in that mandate was a decision by the government to define what counts as a religious organization and what doesn't count as a religious organization. So to compromise and to carve out exemptions means we're leaving it in somebody else's hands to decide who counts and who doesn't count. Now, the response is, well, listen, but we need some sort of compromise. You're going to want it when we have it. And I want to go back to something that Lawrence said, and it's something that's absolutely critical to remember. When the Alliance Defending Freedom, great friends of ours, when the Alliance Defending Freedom goes to court, they do their best, but there's no guarantee that they're going to win. T.S. Eliot put it this way: for us, there's only the trying. The rest is none of our business. The rest of the business belongs only and always to God. And we have hope for this cultural moment, not because this cultural moment is going to work out this way or that way, but because the cultural moment has meaning as part of the larger story of the restoration and redemption found through Christ of the cosmos that we read about in Holy Scripture. Aren't you glad that the Bible doesn't just tell us how to behave, but the Bible gives us the framework of all of reality? It tells us where everything came from, and it tells us where everything is going. It takes us from the beginning to the new beginning. And at the center of this story is a truth that is the most true thing about this moment. In fact, it's the most true thing about any moment in human history. It's true not only about us, it's true about our brothers and sisters right now in Nigeria, who on Lawrence's scale are way down at the other end, facing persecution at an unimaginable level because of their religious convictions. You know what's true about them and what's true about us? Christ is risen from the dead. Chuck Olson would say, because Christ is risen from the dead, despair is a sin. So we join this issue not because we're going to win. We join this issue because Christ is risen. And the Christ who is risen from the dead and will never be dead again has placed us in this cultural moment to join in His ministry of reconciliation. How do we do that? I'll give you 4 quick questions. You're in a cultural moment. That moment is defined by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The most true thing that will happen, no matter what happens, and no matter who wins the next election, what the Supreme Court decides next, what happens to our brothers and sisters in Nigeria facing challenges from Fulani herdsmen, you know what is true? Christ is risen from the dead. So what we can do is live in that reality. And we can ask, what's good here that we can champion and protect? We should champion religious liberty because it is a good. Not every context has it. Our context does. Let's stand for it. Another question is, what's missing that we can contribute? You might be on the call today and you don't have religious liberty in that context. Aren't you glad that there were people throughout history that looked in a particular government context or a cultural context and said, you know what, religious convictions need to be protected here. Christians believe we're made in the image of God. God's the great creator. We're creative. So Christians can contribute by what they create. What's good? What's missing? Secondly, what's evil that needs to stop? Sometimes the most loving thing we can do, and to quote William F. Buckley, is to stand athwart the throes of history and yell no. But as Christians, we don't say no to a particular behavior, a particular idea, a particular way of doing things because we say no. We say no ultimately because God always has a much bigger, better yes. And then finally, what's broken? What's broken here that we can restore? So think about that. God's placed you in this cultural moment. You have a calling to this cultural moment. Look at the world around you. What's good? What's missing? What's evil? What's broken? And then we get to work. To us, there's only the trying. The rest is none of our business. Thank you.